A 7.8 magnitude earthquake struck southeastern Turkey on February 6, the strongest to hit the country since 1939. The epicenter was near the large city of Gaziantep, which has a population of over 1 million people. Shocks were also felt in Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and on the border between Armenia and Georgia. The death toll from the earthquake could rise to more than 40,000, according to Erdogan's latest statement. Hundreds of buildings were destroyed, including the Turkish fortress of Gaziantep, built during the Roman Empire, and the UNESCO World Heritage citadel in Aleppo, Syria. Many published videos show high-rise buildings in Turkey collapsing even after an earthquake. In many places, people still refuse to go inside for fear that the standing buildings could collapse at any moment. Such brutal footage has led to strong domestic criticism of the country's construction industry. In Istanbul, for example, houses were already designed to meet modern earthquake-resistant standards, while many old high-rises remain in the southeast of the country. The most striking example here is Japan, where multi-story buildings did indeed collapse after one of the strongest earthquakes in 2011, but only swayed. In this country, for obvious reasons, earthquake engineering in general is the most advanced in the world. This is, for example, the so-called floating house. In its normal state, the house stands on an ordinary foundation, but without a rigid coupling to it. The frame holds a seismic sensor, or even more than one, and in the house itself there is a computer linked to the sensor and an air supercharger. Once the sensor sends an alarm signal to the computer, the blower creates an airbag under the house. The structure is lifted into the air and stays that way until the ground comes back to a calm state. Just look at the water in the aquarium and in the glass of wine. And in Tokyo's Lego-like skyscraper, in which the local city hall is located, every 10 floors move independently of each other. The latest in earthquake-resistant construction, however, are seismic dampers, or shock absorbers, each of which can withstand loads of hundreds of tons. As a result, the whole house shifts, and in order to prevent it from being ripped away from the utility systems, the connecting parts are made of flexible materials. Japan also has an earthquake early warning system. More than 4,000 seismographs are installed around the country, and if at least 2 of them detect tremors, they immediately determine the approximate area of an earthquake and its epicenter. If an amplification of oscillations is expected, the Japan Meteorological Agency will warn the population straight away. The effectiveness of the warning depends on the area in which the transmitter is located. Even with such a seemingly effective system in the epicenter zone, earthquakes can occur before the warning is received. And yet, on average, after receiving a warning, there is about a minute to take action. This time is used to find shelter or get out of the danger zone. Railway workers slow down trains and factory workers suspend work. It turns out that even in the most developed country in this regard, taking into account the most advanced earthquake-proof construction and a warning system in place, you still have at best about a minute to prepare for a cataclysm. That's what shocks all of us so emotionally about this natural phenomenon. It can occur all of a sudden at night or early in the morning, as in Turkey, when people simply don't have time to realize you are asleep, and the next thing you know, you're under a ton of rubble. Turkish seismologists have compared what happened to the earthquake in 1999. One of Turkey's most destructive earthquakes with a magnitude of 7.7 struck near Istanbul, in Izmit, on the coast of the Sea of Marmara. Nearly 17,500 people were killed. The area of destruction covered about 30,000 square kilometers in the most densely populated northwestern part of the country, affecting parts of Istanbul as well. At the time, the tremor virtually razed Izmit to the ground, a local oil refinery went up in flames, and Istanbul was left without electricity. What are the documented strongest earthquakes we know of? Where do they come from? And what does the future hold for humanity? Let's find out. Thousands of victims, massive destruction, and years spent eliminating the consequences. No matter how technologically advanced humanity is, it hasn't yet learned how to cope with tremors and forces of nature accompanying them. Let's take a look at the largest earthquakes since 1900. Messina, Italy, the 28th of December, 1908. An earthquake measuring 7.5 struck the island of Sicily. It might not have gone down in history as one of the most devastating, but the death toll was unexpectedly huge. The scale of human losses was later blamed on residents and leaders of the region, who who didn't pay due attention to construction recommendations and didn't take into account the experience of previous disasters caused by seismic activity. Strong tremors destroyed Messina in a matter of seconds and caused a tsunami with waves up to 12 meters high. More than 100,000 people lost their lives as a result of the disaster, and around 40 villages and small towns were completely destroyed. When dawn broke, the magnitude of the devastation could be seen. Haiyuan, China, the 16th of December, 1920. Another terrible earthquake with a magnitude of 7.8 struck China's Gansu province in Haiyuan County in 1920. The death toll exceeded 200,000. Crustal movements caused devastation in 7 regions of the country, from the Yellow Sea to the borders with Mongolia. Entire villages were buried under landslides, and the cracks in the ground reached up to 200 kilometers long. The natural disaster itself wasn't the only cause of deaths. About 20,000 earthquake victims simply couldn't build strong, warm homes, so they died of cold when winter arrived. Kanto, Japan, the 1st of September, 1923. A magnitude 8.3 earthquake which happened in Japan in 1923 is considered the most destructive in the country's history. The epicenter of the catastrophe, dubbed the Great Kanto Earthquake, was located 90 kilometers from Tokyo. According to official figures, the total death toll was 170,000, with another 500,000 missing. More than 350 aftershocks occurred over 2 days, with the major cities of Tokyo and Yokohama almost completely destroyed and fishing villages on the coast and Sagami Bay washed away by 15-meter-high waves. The damage was estimated at $4.5 billion, twice the country's annual budget at the time. Ashgabat, Turkmenistan, the 5th of October, 1948. In 1948, a magnitude 7.3 earthquake severely damaged the capital and surrounding villages, and affected the village of Darajez in neighboring Iran. The death toll reached 110,000. According to eyewitnesses, the night before the disaster there were flashes of light of unclear origin in the sky and dogs were behaving strangely. They were howling and trying to drag their owners outside by their clothes. The first tremor occurred in the middle of the night, when people were asleep. Within 10 seconds, the city was practically wiped off the map. Ashgabat was cut off from the outside world, electricity was out of order, telephone service was disrupted and transport was disabled. Under such conditions, it was difficult to inform the population of what was happening. The lack of communication and medical supplies and the destruction of hospitals led to even greater losses. Once regular aid began to arrive from Moscow and cities in other Soviet republics and a military patrol arrived to fight looting, the situation was brought under control. The city was cleared, and many of the victims were sent to neighboring Azerbaijan and Uzbekistan. Ashgabat wasn't prepared for the onset of cold weather in winter, and the remaining residents continued to flee their city. 5 years later, the capital was rebuilt with one-story buildings, and a memorial to the victims of the terrible tragedy was unveiled in 2014. Chimbote, Peru, the 31st of May, 1970. The epicenter of the earthquake, located in the Pacific Ocean at a depth of more than 60 kilometers, caused the strongest aftershocks of magnitude 7.9. The underwater activity triggered landslides in some Peruvian cities and settlements. For example, in Yungay, 70% of the town's residents were buried alive by a snowed slab which fell from Mount Huascaran. The falling glacier reached speeds of up to 200 kilometers per hour. Only 300 people survived by hiding in the cemetery. The village of Huaraz was also badly affected, with almost all the buildings destroyed. The disaster ruined transport infrastructure and paralyzed communications between the towns. Cracks appeared in the Pan-American Highway, further complicating the situation of the surviving residents. General Juan Alvarado, who was leading the country at the time, was personally involved in delivering food and medicine to the victims in the areas cut off from aid. Officially 70,000 people have been confirmed as victims, but some sources put the death toll at more than 100,000. The damage caused by the disaster exceeded $260 million. Tangshan, China, the 28th of July, 1976. An earthquake of magnitude 8.2 killed hundreds of thousands of people. According to official statistics, 255,000 residents were killed and some estimates are over 655,000. Despite the fact that the earthquake occurred 160 kilometers from Beijing, the devastation also reached the densely populated metropolis. The natural disaster is thought to be the second largest in history and the first in terms of deaths in the last 4 centuries. The first tremor was followed by powerful aftershocks that buried rescuers and survivors of the initial shock under the rubble. Natural force practically wiped out cities and villages. The epicenter of the disaster was home to not the wealthiest Chinese, which meant that population density was high, and furthermore the main shock occurred at night, when people were asleep, and it was impossible to be coherent without panic. Prior to the incident, the area wasn't considered seismically dangerous. The government had hidden data about the tragedy, refusing international assistance and coverage of the truth about the victims. For this reason, the Red Cross was unable to deliver medicine and food. As a result, the number of casualties was increasing. It took almost 10 years to rebuild Tangshan. An event with so many fatalities is unlikely to have positive consequences, yet the Tangshan earthquake has contributed to the increased attention to disaster forecasting among scientists. Spitak, Armenia, the 7th of December, 1988. A terrible earthquake in Armenia with a magnitude of 7.2 completely destroyed the Armenian city of Spitak and a number of neighboring villages within half a minute. Nearly 40% of the country was affected by the tremors, with a death toll of 25,000. Almost 150,000 people were injured or left disabled, and more than 500,000 lost their homes. There are different versions of the cause of the catastrophe. Some believe that weapons testing triggered the tremors, others believe the disaster was natural. Whatever happened 30 years ago, experts said the energy released during the rupture was commensurate in scale with the explosion of 10 atomic bombs. Survivors said buildings literally erupted into the air during the shocks and then fell to the ground, turning into deadly rubble under which residents of the houses were buried. The terrible tragedy brought the Soviet Union republics together. People sent clothes, food, medicine to Armenia and were ready to help in any way they could. A memorial for the innocent victims, for the merciful hearts, was erected in Jumri to commemorate the tragedy. Sumatra, Indonesia, the 26th of December, 2004. A 9.1 magnitude earthquake caused by a sudden rupture in the seabed caused more than 220,000 deaths. More than 1.8 million people lost their homes as a result of the disaster and subsequent tsunami in 14 countries in Asia and East Africa. There was no escape from the tsunami. The giant wave at the speed of 720 kilometers per hour was rapidly approaching the coastal zone, where it reached a height of 30 meters in the surge zone and a speed of 36 kilometers per hour. After 1.5 hours, the wave reached the coast of Thailand, where about 2,500 tourists were killed in addition to locals, then passed the Maldives, leaving another 100 people dead, and struck Sri Lanka and India, where about 50,000 people were killed. Another 7 hours later, the tsunami reached the shores of East Africa, where a lack of information about the terrible threat also killed people. This case clearly demonstrated the urgent need for public awareness of disasters in the seismically active Indian Ocean, as theoretically almost 60,000 people had a few hours to flee the coastline but were unaware of the approaching disaster. Economic detriment of the countries affected by the disaster exceeded $10 billion. Sichuan, China, the 12th of May, 2008. A devastating 7.9 magnitude earthquake in the Sichuan region affected not only the major Chinese cities of Beijing and Shanghai, 1,500 to 2,000 kilometers from the epicenter, but also India, Thailand, Vietnam, Bangladesh, Mongolia, and even Russia. More than 350,000 people were injured, 15 million were evacuated, and the death toll reached 90,000. On the same day, a second tremor of magnitude 6 occurred, increasing the number of victims. The damage caused by the earthquake was estimated at $86 billion. The earthquake struck during the day when people were at work and children were in schools. At one school of the region alone, 1,000 schoolchildren and teachers were reported dead and missing. Although the disaster occurred in an area of high seismic activity, experts say the nature of the disaster is man-made. The cause of the tremors could have been water pressure at a hydroelectric power plant located 6 kilometers from the epicenter. Haiti, the 12th of January, 2010. A catastrophic magnitude 7 earthquake in Haiti killed more than 220,000 people and caused devastating damage to the nation's capital, Port-au-Prince, home to a third of the country's population, and nearly 100,000 buildings that were razed to the ground. The region hadn't experienced a disaster of such magnitude in the past 250 years, so no special standards relevant to areas of high seismic activity were applied to the construction of buildings. The quake originated at a depth of 10 kilometers and was followed by 2 weaker aftershocks of magnitude 5.9 and 5.5. Haiti is a country where most population lives in poverty, in slums and shacks, and as a consequence the republic has a very high population density. Almost 2 million people were made homeless as a result of the earthquake. The material damage amounted to almost $8 billion. Unfortunately, the country's misfortunes weren't limited to natural disasters. The massive destruction led to anarchy, looting, increased violence, and the formation of gangs and refugee camps. Moreover, while other countries helped to fight the famine, the local authorities couldn't cope with the sanitary epidemiological challenges, and a cholera epidemic swept over the country. Many questions have remained about the international funds allocated for the elimination of the consequences of the disaster. For example, millions were spent on public service announcements urging Haitians to wash their hands, but their relevance in the absence of detergents and clean water was considered questionable. Could it be that our planet is splitting apart? Of course, this scenario is too fantastic, but because of nature's unpredictability, anything is possible. Write in the comments what you think about it. Don't forget to rate this video and subscribe to our channel. See you in the new episodes.